1 Maccabees chapter 3. The early victories of Judas. Then Judas his son, who was called Maccabees, took command in his place. All his brothers and all who joined his father helped him. They gladly fought for Israel. He extended the glory of his people. Like a giant, he put on his breastplate. He girded on his armor of war and waged battle, protecting the host by his sword. He was like a lion in his deeds, like a lion's cub roaring for prey. He searched out and pursued the lawless. He burned those who troubled his people. Lawless men shrank back for fear of him. All the evildoers were confounded, and deliverance prospered by his hand. He embittered many kings, but he made Jacob glad by his deeds, and his memory is blessed forever. He went through the cities of Judah. He destroyed the ungodly out of the land. Thus he turned away wrath from Israel. He was renowned to the ends of the earth. He gathered in those who were perishing. But Apollonius gathered together Gentiles and a large force from Samaria to fight against Israel. When Judas learned from it, he went out to meet him, and he defeated and killed him. Many were wounded and fell, and the rest fled. Then they seized their spoils, and Judas took the sword of Apollonius and used it in the battle for the rest of his life. Now, when Siren, the commander of the Syrian army, heard that Judas had gathered a large army company, including a body of faithful men who stayed with him and went out to battle, he said, "I will make a name for myself and win honor in the kingdom. I will make war on Judas and his companions who scorned the king's commands." And again, a strong army of ungodly men went up with him to help him, to take vengeance on the sons of Israel. When he approached the ascent of Bethrohon, Judas went out to meet him with a small company. But when they saw the army coming to meet him, they said to Judas, "How can we, few as we are, fight against so great and strong a multitude? And we are faint, for we have eaten nothing today." Judas replied, "It is easy for many to be hemmed in by few, for in the sight of heaven there is no difference between saving by many or by few. It is not on the size of the army that victory in battle depends, but strength comes from heaven. They come against us in great pride and lawlessness to destroy us and our wives and our children, and to despoil us. But we fight for our lives and our law. He himself will crush them before us. As for you, do not be afraid of them." When he finished speaking, he rushed suddenly against Siron and his army, and they were crushed before him. They pursued them down the descent of Bethrohoron to the plain. 800 of them fell, and the rest fled to the land of the Philistines. Then Judas and his brothers began to be feared, and terror fell upon the Gentiles round about them. His fame reached the king, and the Gentiles talked of the battles of Judah. The policy of Antiochus. When the king Antiochus heard these reports, he was greatly angered, and he sent and gathered all the forces of his kingdom, a very strong army. And he opened his coffers and gave a year's pay to his forces, and ordered them to be ready for any need. Then he saw that money in the treasury was exhausted, and that the revenues from the country were small because of the dissension and disaster which he had caused in the land by abolishing the laws that had existed from the earliest days. He feared that he might not have such funds as he had before for his expenses and for his gifts, which he used to give more lavishly than preceding kings. He was greatly perplexed in mind and determined to go to Persia and collect the revenues from those regions and raise a large fund. He left Lysias, a distinguished man of royal lineage, in charge of the king's affairs from the river Euphrates to the borders of Egypt. Lysias was also to take care of Antiochus his son until he returned. And he turned over to Lysias half of his troops and the elephants, and gave him orders about all that he wanted done. As for the residents of Judea and Jerusalem, Lysias was to send a force against them to wipe out and destroy the strength of Israel and the remnant of Jerusalem. He was to banish the memory of them from the place, settle aliens in their territory, and distribute their land. Then the king took the remaining half of his troops and departed from Antioch, his capital, in 147th year. He crossed the Euphrates River and went through the upper provinces. Preparations for battle. Lysias chose Ptolemy, the son of Dorymenes, and Nicanor, and Gorgias, mighty men among the friends of the king, and sent them the 40,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry to go into the land of Judah and destroy it, as the king had commanded. So they departed with their entire force, and they arrived where they encamped near Emmaus in the plain, where the traders of the land heard what was said of them. They took silver and gold in immense amounts and fetters, and went to the camp to get the sons of Israel for slaves. And forces from Syria and land of Philistine joined them. Now Judas and his brothers saw that misfortunes had increased and that their forces were encamped in their territory. They also learned what the king had commanded to do to the people to cause their final destruction. But they said to one another, "Let us prepare the destruction of our people and fight for our people and the sanctuary." And the congregation assembled to be ready for battle, and to pray and ask for mercy and compassion. Jerusalem was uninhabited like a wilderness. Not one of her children went in or out. The sanctuary was trampled down, and the sons of aliens held the citadel. It was a lodging place for the Gentiles. Joy was taken from Jacob. The flute and the harp ceased to play. So they assembled and went to Mizpah, opposite Jerusalem, because Israel formerly had a place of prayer in Mizpah. They fasted that day, put on sackcloth, and sprinkled ashes on their heads, and rented their clothes. And they opened the books of law to inquire into those matters about which the Gentiles were consulting the image of their idols. They also brought the garments of priesthood, and the first fruits, and the tithes, and they stirred up the Nazirites who had completed their days, and cried aloud to heaven, saying, "What shall we do with these? Where shall we take them?" thy sanctuary is trampled down and profaned, and thy priests mourn in humiliation. And behold, the Gentiles are assembled against us to destroy us. Thou knowest what they plot against us. How will we be able to withstand them, if thou dost not help us? Then they sounded the trumpets and gave a loud shout. After this, Judas appointed leaders of the people, in charge of thousands and hundreds and fifties and tens. And he said to those who were building houses, or were betrothed, or were planting vineyards, or were faint-hearted, and each should return to his home according to the law. Then the army marched out and encamped to the south of Emmaus. And Judas said, Gird yourselves and be valiant. Be ready in the morning to fight with these Gentiles who have assembled against us to destroy us and our sanctuary. It is better for us to die in battle than to see the misfortunes of our nation and of the sanctuary. But as his will in heaven may be, so he will do. 1 Maccabees chapter 4. The battle at Emmaus. Now Gorgias took 5,000 infantry and 1,000 picked cavalry, and this division moved out by night to fall upon the camp of the Jews and attack them suddenly. Men from the citadel were his guides. But Judas heard of it, and he and his mighty men moved out to attack the king's force in Emmaus. While the division was still absent from the camp, when Gorgias entered the camp of Judas by night, he found no one there. So he looked for them in the hills, because he said, These men are fleeing from us. At daybreak, Judas appeared in the plain with 3,000 men, but they did not have armor and swords such as they desired. And they saw the camp of the Gentiles strong and fortified, with cavalry round about. And these men were trained in war. But Judas said to the men who were with them, Do not fear their number or be afraid when they charge. Remember how our fathers were saved at the Red Sea, when Pharaoh with his forces pursued them. And now let us cry to heaven to see whether he will favor us and remember his covenant with our fathers and crush his army before us today. Then all the Gentiles will know that there is one who redeems and saves Israel. When the foreigners looked up and saw them coming against them, they went forth from their camp to battle. Then the men with Judas blew their trumpets and engaged in battle. The Gentiles were crushed and fled into the plain, and all those in the rear fell by the sword. They pursued them to Gazara and to the plains of Idumea and to Azotus and Jamnia, and 3,000 of them fell. Then Judas and his force turned back from pursuing them, and he said to people, Do not be greedy for plunder, for there is a battle before us. Gorgias and his force are near us in the hills. But stand now against our enemies and fight them, and afterwards seize the plunder boldly. Just as Judas was finishing his speech, a detachment appeared coming out of the hill. They saw that their army had been put to fight and that the Jews were burning the camp. For the smoke that was seen showed that what had happened. When they perceived this, they were greatly frightened. And when they also saw the army of Judas drawn up in the plain for battle, they all fled into the land of the Philistines. Then Judas returned to the plunder camp And they seized much gold and silver, and cloth dyed blue and sea purple, and great riches. On their return they sang hymns and praises to heaven, for he is good, and his mercy endures forever. Thus Israel had a great deliverance that day. First campaign of Lysias. Those of the foreigners who escaped went and reported to Lysias all that had happened. When he heard it, he was perplexed and discouraged, for things had not happened to Israel as he had intended, nor had they turned out as the king had commanded him. But the next year he mustered 60,000 picked infantrymen and 5,000 cavalry to subdue them. They came to Idumaeus and encamped at Bethzur, and Judas met them with 10,000 men. When he saw that the army was strong, he prayed, saying, Blessed art thou, O Saviour of Israel, who didst crush the attack of the mighty warrior by the hand of thy servant David, and didst give the camp of the Philistines into the hands of Jonathan, the son of Saul, and of the man who carried his armor. So do thou him in his army by the hand of thy people Israel, and let them be ashamed of their troops and their cavalry. Fill them with cowardice, melt the boldness of their strength, let them tremble in their destruction. Strike them down with the sword of those who love thee, and let all who know thy name praise thee with hymns. Then both sides attacked, and they fell of the army of Lysis. 5,000 men, they fell in action. And when Lysias saw the rout of his troops, and observed the boldness which inspired those of Judas, and how ready they were, either to live or to die nobly, he departed to Antioch and enlisted mercenaries to invade Judea again with an even larger army. Cleansing and dedication of the temple. Then said Judas and his brother, Behold, our enemies are crushed. Let us go up to cleanse the sanctuary and dedicate it. So all the army assembled, and they went up to the Mount Zion. And they saw the sanctuary desolate, the altar profaned, and the gates burnt. In the courts they saw bushes sprung up as in a thicket, and as on one of the mountains. They also saw the chambers of the priests in ruin. Then they rent their clothes and mourned with great lamentation, and sprinkled themselves with ash. They fell face down on the ground, and sounded the signal on the trumpets, and cried out to heaven. Then Judas detailed men to fight against those in the citadel until he had cleaned the sanctuary. He chose blameless priests devoted to the law, and they cleansed the sanctuary and removed the defiled stones to an unclean place. They deliberated what to do about the altar of burnt offering, which had been profaned, and they thought it best to tear it down, lest it bring reproach upon them, for the Gentiles had defiled it. So they tore down the altar and stored the stones in a convenient place on the temple hill until there should come a prophet to tell what to do with them. Then they took unhewn stones, as the law directs, and built a new altar like the former one. They also rebuilt the sanctuary and the interior of the temple, and consecrated the courts. They made new holy vessels, and brought the lampstands, the altar of the incense, and the table into the temple. Then they burnt incense on the altar and lighted the lamps on the lampstand, and these gave light in the temple. They placed the bread on the table and hung up the curtains. Thus, they finished all the work that they had undertaken. Early in the morning, on the 25th day of the 19th month, which is the month of Chislev, in the 148th year, they rose and offered sacrifice as the Lord directs on the new altar of burnt offering which they had built. At the very season and on the very day that Gentiles had profaned it. It was dedicated with songs and harps and lutes and cymbals. All the people fell on their faces and worshipped and blessed heaven, who had prospered them. So they celebrated the dedication of the altar for 8 days and offered burnt offerings with gladness. They offered a sacrifice of deliverance and praise. They decorated the front of the temple with golden crowns and small shields. They restored the gates and the chambers for the priests and furnished them with doors. There was a great gladness among the people, and the reproach of Gentiles was removed. Then Judas and his brothers and all the assembly of Israel determined that every year at the season, the days of the dedication of the altar should be observed with gladness and joy for 8 days, beginning with the 25th day of the month of Chislev. At the time, they fortified Mount Zion with high walls and strong towers round about, to keep the Gentiles from coming and trampling them down as they had done before. And he stationed a garrison there to hold it. He also fortified Bethzur, so that the people might have a stronghold that faced it